if we borrow to pay off the current backlog, 6.2, it would go to the vendors in the backlog. Is that going to be enough to completely erase our backlog of bills, or does there need to be more cutting from state spending to avoid being back in this situation in a year or two down the road, given where some of the money from the tax increase has already been targeted?
Yeah, well, there are really two parts to that answer. No, it doesn't pay every possible bill, but what it does is take us down to a normal payment cycle. I mean, if you want me to kind of go through the numbers, we did an analysis early on. It came up with a number of 8.75 as fiscal 11 unpaid bills. A few months later, Comptroller Topeka did an analysis and furnished it to the legislative staffs and others, and she came up with a slightly different number, 8.3 billion in fiscal 11 bills. This is fiscal 11, not fiscal 12. This is the hangover. This is the overhang that built up during the recession. It built up during the structural deficit for the tax increase. The difference in our two numbers is about the amount of interfund borrowing. She didn't count the interfund borrowing, we did, and that has to be repaid in 18 months. So if let's just take our number, right, 8.3, and then subtract the borrowing of 6.2, there's 2.1 left over. If you add back in the interfund borrowing, you get up to about 2.5, right? So 2.5 billion, when you have 34 billion, to use the Senate number, in revenues in GRF, that's about 7% of annual spending. That's a normal payment cycle, we believe. So this doesn't pay all the bills, but it pays enough of the bills to put us back in a normal situation.
What if you use the number that's closer to 33.2, which is what the House is, and what it appears the momentum is taking towards? Does that then add another billion to that, and there's 3.5?
Well, I mean, here's the way we look at that. I think that if you take that number, okay, that's a 33.2, right, which is the number the House is using for revenues, but they're using the same amount as they're spending. They're talking about maintaining the balance, which means we would still have this carryover of 2.5 we haven't paid, even though they haven't added to it. That's 2.5. That's still a normal payment cycle. This is the objective. It's being articulated in both the House and Senate. It's slightly different numbers. That we're going to match the revenue number to the spending number so that this problem, this borrowing problem and buildup of debt problem, does not recur. And that's the objective, and we think that's an attainable objective going forward.
Now, that 2.5, would that just sort of be the cash flow as you manage the bills throughout the year? It wouldn't. You're not trying to take the backlog down to absolute zero and have it be where everything's paid off.
No, I mean, it's been a long time since Illinois has been a normal cash flow. That's bad, but we can get back there, and we think the debt restructuring is a key to doing that. Now, as you go forward, and you have economic growth, say 3%. COG5, I think, predicted 3.1. We've been looking at a slightly lower number of 2.8. Coming out of a recession, you often could do more than 3%. So these are conservative numbers. These are not exaggerations of revenue growth. But if you go from this is fiscal 12 that we're talking about now, but if you project on forward into fiscal 13, this 33.2 will become about 34.2 with 3% revenue growth, which means next year there will be, if we spend all that money, 34.2, and you're in exactly the same situation. You have a balance going forward. You'll still have the normal payment cycle of 2.5 left over. What we've got to do in this period of 12, 13, and 14 is address these longer-term spending pressures, because 3% growth in spending needs to match up to 3% growth in revenues to maintain a balanced budget. And the two greatest challenges to that, we know what they are. They're pensions and Medicaid. And Medicaid has been growing at a lot more than 3% for a long time, and that's why the Medicaid reform that was passed in January is very important. to restrain that. That's why the governor has proposed a rate cut for Medicaid to restrain that to hospitals and nursing homes and for prescription drugs.
What has the Medicaid growth been?
It's been close to 8%. And many people say we need to get it down to 6% or less. I believe the governor agrees with them, and that's what we tried to budget to. I know the governor agrees with them. We tried to budget that this year. If you reduce the rates, you reduce what you pay, you can maintain the coverage. Nobody gets turned away. You still serve the 2.4 million people on Medicaid by squeezing down the cost a little bit. That's what happens in a recession, you know. Rents go down, prices go down. Sometimes people say everywhere but in the medical world and on college tuition. But, you know, we think that needs to be pushed down to help that. The other challenge is pension reform.
What's the growth for pension reform?
Well, it's quite a bit. We came here in a bigger crisis than this. This looks better compared to January 29th, 2009, when we first arrived here with Pat Quinn. This looked much, much worse. And we were going deeper into the recession. And when we first started talking pension reform in 2009 with organized labor and other interested groups, we were talking about the difference between a pension contribution of $2.2 billion and $2.8. This year it's 4.1 GRF. By fiscal 15, I think it is, it'll go up over 5 under the current schedule. So it and Medicaid grow a lot, and they put the squeeze on other spending, you know. So it becomes very hard to maintain human service spending and education spending and public safety spending because these two fast-growing areas put a squeeze on. So that's the longer-term challenge, is to be able to maintain spending when you've got these very significant spending pressures that are hard to control.
In that, when you go 33.2 or 33.2, 34.2, you know, next year or FY12, FY13, does that take into account the debt service on what it would cost to pay back this, or is that going to then be in addition to the natural growth of Medicaid and pensions?
We have programmed the debt service as flat. And, you know, I've got the schedule here. I don't know if you can see it on the camera or not. But we've programmed the debt service as flat in the 7-year payment schedule. And we think that's very important. The green bars there on your chart, if you can see the color, that's the existing debt service for all the general obligation debt of the state. And the pink, I call it, I don't know if that's the right color, the pink, I call it, up at the top that lasts for 7 years, that's the debt service on the debt restructuring. It's generally about $900 to $1 billion a year, varies just slightly. It's what we call level payment of debt service. And so, you know, all that debt service peaks at about $3 billion, which is a little less than 9% of our general revenues. We think that's a reasonable repayment of debt level for our state government, and we think it's affordable, and we've got a plan to repay it. It's also not backloaded, I will add, and on the chart when you head it up there, you'll see that the whole debt service schedule is also not debt backloaded. Backloaded means when you're paying $2 billion in debt service this year, and next year you got to pay $3 billion, and next year you got to pay $4 billion, you know, and you hit that curve and you can't do it. What you want to have is this year you want to pay $3 billion in debt service, you know, and in a few years you want to pay less than $2 billion in debt service, and in a few years you want to pay less than $1 billion years in debt service. That's a responsible debt service schedule that is sustainable, as opposed to one that's going to get you in trouble.
All right, one more set of numbers for the blackboard. Show me up there on the board, where does the $6 to $7 billion from the tax increase go, and how does that eliminate the structural deficit, or how does that not go to pay the backlog of bills? I think that there's some miscommunication, misunderstanding.
Yeah.
I think that people think that the tax increase is going to do everything, and I don't know if it's going to do one or both, but it's, what are we using, 6 or 7 billion from the tax increase?
You know, it's about 7. I mean, we don't totally know because we haven't collected it yet, you know. But the Department of Revenue is pretty good at projecting what when you just change the rate in a kind of tax you're already collecting. So there's $7 billion a year. It's part of this 33, right? $7 billion a year. So that's a pretty big change, you know, when you've gone up 7, around 33. But before fiscal 12, we were not paying the pension bond. We were not, I mean, the pension debt service, or the pension payment is what I really mean to say. I've said it wrong twice, better say it right once. We weren't paying the pension payment. We borrowed to pay the pension payment. We're not going to do that in fiscal 12. We're not going to do that in fiscal 13. We're not going to do that in fiscal 14, you know. So that pension payment, which is now over $4 billion, going to $5 billion, is coming out of that tax increase, right? So we've taken something we weren't paying. That's what a structural deficit is. You have a liability, you have something you have to pay, but you don't have the revenues to pay it. You're in structural deficit, you know. Some people would say you're going broke when you're doing that, but you can only keep doing that a short period of time. You know, that leaves another $3 billion, right? We've added another $1 billion in debt service with a debt restructuring. You know, that leaves it, you know, now we have a net of 2 out of the tax increase. So most of the tax increase is committed to these things we weren't paying. Another big one is the group insurance system, right? Last year we appropriated group insurance at $700 million. It really cost us about $1.3 billion, $1.4 billion, right? So half of that we weren't paying. That's 0.7, right? So that leaves another $1.3 billion. So we don't have a lot of extra money out of this tax increase to do a lot of new things that people want us to do, and that's what makes this a difficult process.
Is there an expectation that the revenue from the tax increase, that the $7 billion will continue to grow on pace with the needs for the pension payment up to 5 by 15, as well as the growth in Medicaid, to keep pace, or are we going to see all of that revenue then just get swallowed up and run a deficit because spending could outgrow the rate of growth in revenue?
Well, that's why jobs are so important and how we grow jobs. We've had 15 straight months now of declining unemployment in Illinois. We've been leading the Midwest in job growth. You know, one of the big reasons is we have an export economy in Illinois. That means, if you have an export economy, that means you're competing in the world. That's a world standard. And we just got the data this week on how much exports have grown in Illinois in the last year, ending March 31st. We're up over 30%. That's leading our economy. That's leading our economic growth. And that's a real key. So if that continues and our economy continues to grow and we continue to grow jobs and we pass workman's comp reform and other kind of reforms that help our productivity and our competitiveness even more, that's really the key to whether this stays in balance, along with how much you cut spending as you need to maintain the balance as well.
Does the numbers look like they're going to get awfully small and the state's going to depend on that? How can the tax increase remain temporary after 4 years without either a massive recovery to pump $7 billion in, or we're either going to have to get $7 billion worth of regenerated growth or $7 billion in cuts if that increase is going to be temporary, or is that just sort of a 4 year from now problem?
Yeah. Well, all these we think if you have economic growth, all these numbers grow. You know, the revenue numbers grow. And at higher rates, of course, they grow a little more off a high base. So in 4 years, if we're growing $1 billion a year in revenues, right, which we are at about 3%, which is not an outlandish number, in 4 years you've got $4 billion more revenues on the base than you had. Okay, so when you lose 7, and you don't lose 7, okay. We go from 5 to 3.75 in 4 years. We don't lose it all. Only 1.25% is 4 year temporary. The other 0.5% is 14 year temporary. The other 1.25% is permanent. So we don't lose all the 7. We only lose about 4.5 of the 7. So if the revenue growth offsets that loss, we're in good shape. If our economy is strong, we think, and we maintain this balance, and we do pension reform, and we do Medicaid reform, and we do budgeting for results and keep our spending under control, we think we're in good shape. And then we'll have the big debate in the 2014 election. This was designed that way. They have a public policy debate in a gubernatorial election, and then the tax increase will expire, and the new governor and the General Assembly will decide, you know, did we make it? Do we need to do something different? I mean, we don't know that answer today. But we think we've got a very sound case for how we get there.
Last question, and this goes to sort of the tone we're taking with the pension reform story. as the pension payment grows, as Medicaid grows, that means that there's going to be less money for other things, higher education, K through 12 education, human services. How do you deal with that without raising revenues? I mean, the cuts that were instituted this year, just to get to 33.2, there was wailing and gnashing of teeth. If you're going to have to find another $1 billion by FY15 to go even just the increase in the pension payment, is this as good as it's going to get for people who don't want the state budget cut? Or are we going to have to come back and see lawmakers do this year after year to just account for the growth in Medicaid and pensions?
Well, that's the real question, and it's a very good question. The squeeze is real. This is not some unpredictable event. We know that if we don't reform pensions and we don't reform Medicaid, they're going to continue to squeeze out this other very important spending. And some of that spending is also crucial to economic growth. If we squeeze out education and don't have an educated workforce, that won't help us keep the economy growing, and we'll start a downward spiral. And if we don't provide human service spending to deal with the most vulnerable among us, we'll see things we don't want to see that we haven't seen in years, and we'll lose the quality of our social safety net, which nobody wants to lose. So that's really the challenge, but it really underscores how important it is, to do these other reforms in the budget, and it underscores how important it is to concentrate on economic growth, because that's really the answer where you get the growth in revenues to sustain those programs. And I think that's why Governor Quinn likes to call himself the jobs governor, because that's his focus every day.